The acting attorney general of Pennsylvania announced child sexual abuse charges against 5 Pennsylvania men, 2 in Lancaster County, all members of Jehovah's Witnesses. Fox 43's Harry Lee reports on the repercussions for the organization.
Disturbing and sad.
Those are the words Acting Attorney General Mishel Ghenry used to describe alleged child sexual abuse committed by 5 Pennsylvania men. All are members of the Jehovah's Witness religion.
Some of these defendants even used their faith communities to prey upon the victims.
2 of the men charged were members of this Jehovah's Witness congregation in Lancaster.
Happening today, the Pennsylvania House is set to reconvene for its 2023 session. This comes after nearly 2 months of stalled government. Political experts say current House Speaker Mark Rozzi has made it clear that he does not want the House to consider any legislation until it passes a measure regarding child sexual abuse.
44-year-old Norman Aviles Garriga is alleged to have molested at least 3 young children between the ages of 5 and 10 in the late 1990s.
He was an elder in the Jehovah's Witness congregation, which allowed him to build a rapport with members.
42-year-old Abimel Valentin Matos is alleged to have assaulted a 15-year-old girl around 2011.
House Speaker Mark Rozzi said no other bills would pass in the House until the approval of legislation allowing child sex abuse survivors to file lawsuits against their abusers, even if the claim falls outside of the statute of limitations.
I made the promise to victims and survivors that I would get this done.
Rozzi himself is a survivor of child sex abuse and said victims struggling with trauma deserve to tell their stories and hold abusers accountable.
Let's not forget, first, I don't care if you were sexually assaulted as a child in the rectory or your public elementary school, or in the shower by Jerry Sandusky, or at your home, or by a Jehovah's Witness.
The congregation was aware of his romantic interest in the girl, noting that they would approve of it if certain conditions were met, including the presence of a chaperone and the commitment to eventually marry her.
These bills may face a tough time getting through the state Senate. The majority leader for the Republican-controlled chamber said that this statutory limits bill needs to be passed as an amendment and only a constitutional amendment. He also said that he wants to see it passed as part of a package of amendments that deal with issues like voter ID and regulations.
Jehovah's Witnesses have an internal disciplinary system for complaints of child sexual abuse. It's unclear if they investigated these allegations, but the Attorney General's office says all charges stemmed from victims coming forward. Victim advocacy group SNAP says the organization itself needs to be held accountable.
Officials within the faith that knew of this abuse did nothing. To me, that's complicit. And being complicit in crimes like these is sometimes as equal to the crime itself.
Henry declined to comment on future charges, citing the ongoing investigation. Jehovah's Witnesses said in a statement, "As Christians, Jehovah's Witnesses despise the mistreatment and abuse of anyone, especially precious children. While it is not appropriate to comment on cases pending before the courts, we want to express our concern for all victims of abuse, regardless of faith."
We have a duty to protect children in Pennsylvania. These children deserve a community where they can grow, play, learn, and pray, and not be preyed upon.
These arrests followed charges filed against 4 other Jehovah's Witness members in October of 2022.
Our office will never stop working to bring justice for those who have been victimized. We will continue to investigate and prosecute anyone who takes advantage and harms the most vulnerable in our society.
And anyone with information regarding child sexual abuse is urged to contact Pennsylvania's Child Line at 1-800-932-0313, and we will have that number for you on our website.
Being in the majority, you dictate the agenda. It would be nice to be able to find some consensus and common ground, but bottom line, we have to move on this. Your victims have been waiting too long, and if it needs just 102 votes, we will deliver them.
I don't believe that's the proper way to run the House. We recognize that they have a 1-seat majority, but this kind of heavy-handedness with a one-seat majority, I think sets very bad precedents going forward. It's something that we never did in the majority, and I'm very sad to see them do it.
My perpetrator was at 12 different parishes before he even came to my parochial school. And I remind everybody in this chamber, when you think about these children being sexually assaulted, being raped, that you put yourself in my position as a 13-year-old boy being raped in the shower. And do you think I knew what a statute of limitations was? And that my statute of limitations was 2 years. That's why we're giving these 2 years back to these victims. And they sure as hell deserve them.
The sex abuse legislation would then go to the Senate. Unclear tonight what the Senate will do with it. It passed the amendment, but had bundled it with 2 others at Senate Bill 1. So it would have to pass a clean version identical to the one in the House in order to get it on the November ballot. Still unclear what will happen there.
Well, a constitutional amendment to provide a 2-year window for victims of childhood sexual assault passed the state Senate last month, but was lumped together with controversial proposals like voter ID. Now the Pennsylvania House is working to pass a standalone piece of legislation that provides only the 2-year window.
Let's talk about statewide news now as House lawmakers finally returned to Harrisburg Tuesday for a special session considering a 2-year window for victims of childhood sex abuse to sue their abusers. The now Democratic-controlled House passed a set of operating rules specifically for this special session, but the rules sparked a lengthy debate between both parties.
Survivors have lobbied the General Assembly to pass this measure as victims continue to work through their abuse as adults. Razi, who is also a victim of childhood sex abuse himself, has been pushing for this special session. This week, lawmakers will be voting on 2 bills, one that would propose an amendment to the state constitution and one that would change the state law. Both of these actions would create that 2-year window. The 2 parties have been in stalemate, with Razi losing Republican support.
You know, this is something we've been talking a lot about recently, but for folks out there who might not be entirely familiar, the 2-year window would open the statute. Abuse could come forward and sue their abuser even if the assault took place decades ago. Now, during today's special session, the House heard proposed amendments to 2 pieces of legislation that offer a parallel path for the 2-year window. One is a statutory bill, and the other a constitutional amendment which, if passed by both chambers, would leave it up to voters to decide on the ballot, potentially by November.
Now, Razi says he will not pass any other legislation until this adult childhood sexual abuse amendment is made, which may also cause Razi to lose Democratic support for his speakership, with many signaling that they will back their original choice, Democratic leader Joanna McClinton. Now, if the House passes the amendment, the Senate will have until next week to convene a special session in order for it to be on the ballot this November.
And at this point, it appears that the constitutional change has more support, and if it passes the House tomorrow, it's definitely good news for victims, but it still has a long ways to go. It's still pretty far from the finish line. Republican Senate leaders said they have fulfilled their commitment to the 2-year window by passing Senate Bill 1, which is that packet, Renata, that you mentioned earlier, which included things like voter ID, and it's a packet that has not been considered by the House and probably won't because of things like voter ID.
Well, Brian, the House has supported in the past legislation that would give child sex abuse survivors the chance to sue their abusers or institutions on claims that would otherwise be considered outdated. And today, they sent a pair of bills to the Senate that make that change.
This could be over next week for the victims and survivors to get justice.
House Speaker Mark Razi said by passing 2 bills creating a 2-year window to revive outdated claims of child sex abuse, victims are one step closer to holding abusers accountable after years of not being able to. One bill is the final leg of a constitutional amendment, while the other is a regular bill that could go into effect after being passed by the Senate and signed by the governor.
We will keep coming back We will keep putting pressure on the Senate to run these pieces of legislation.
On Tuesday, the State House welcomed 3 new members, all Democrats, who give their party a majority in the lower chamber for the first time in over a decade. Once it was official, Democrats introduced a set of operating rules for the special session.
These are rules just for passing the statute of limitation for victims of sexual assault.
Republicans expressed their concerns with the rules.
Complete shutdown of any minority involvement. That is not how we practice. That is not how we acted when we were in the majority.
The debate lasted about 3 hours.
This is nothing more than a delay tactic, and we need to get on with the people's business. Isn't that what y'all said y'all wanted to do for weeks? So let's get on with the people's business.
The rules eventually passed, allowing both a 2-year window statutory bill and constitutional amendment to be sent to a 5-member special committee where they were considered and approved. Minority Leader Brian Cutler says it's good the House is back in action, but calls the rules undemocratic.
Unfortunately, the bad news was, quite frankly, the undemocratic rules that were just recently adopted on the House floor. It's not the underlying issue of the statute of limitations and that process that was ever at debate. At debate is the draconian measures that were contained in the rules, such as a 2/3 majority to pass an amendment.
Cutler says the best path for the 2-year window is by passing Senate Bill 1, which was sent to the House after it passed the Senate last month. It includes the window, but also contains constitutional amendments for voter ID and making it easier for the General Assembly to overturn regulations.
Democrats say Republicans are leveraging victims by using Senate Bill 1 as a way to advance unrelated priorities. Democrats want to see a standalone 2-year window, which the full House is expected to consider for a second time tomorrow. If it passes on third consideration, it will be sent to the Republican-controlled Senate, where it faces an uncertain future.
The House today passed 2 bills, as you mentioned, one a constitutional amendment, the other regular bill, and they're aimed at giving child sex abuse victims the ability to file lawsuits against their abusers or organizations they believe may have essentially have some sort of claim to liability in terms of the abuse. And these pieces of legislation were passed today during a rare Friday morning session here at the House of Representatives. House Speaker Mark Rozzi is somebody who has been backing this legislation. He says that the statute of limitations that has been able to prevent a lot of these lawsuits from being filed is something that the bills would address by giving the victims of child sex abuse 2 years to file those lawsuits on claims that would be otherwise outdated. And Rozzi, a victim of child sex abuse himself, spoke during a press conference after the votes, and he challenged the Senate to take up the bills next week.
Yeah, the struggles that we face here in the House, so difficult. Where since I've taken office, I think I've had at least 5 victims either commit suicide or overdose.
I made a promise when my childhood friend took a gun in 2009, put it to his chest and killed himself. I knew that at that moment I could never be quiet again.
And anyone with information regarding child sexual abuse is urged to contact Pennsylvania's Child Line at 1-800-932-0313, and we will have that number for you on our website.